results. I don't think I will waste any time before inviting Mitali to comment on your paper. Over to you, Mitali.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. So I hope my screen is visible to everybody. And, I think, Purna, this has just been such an interesting read for me, because it's almost feeling like an I told you so moment for me at this point, because to be very honest, I mean, when this policy came out, again, I'm not an academic, but I am a commentator, someone who can't keep her opinions to herself kind of a person. And I wrote a blog in 2017 itself, where actually, essentially I talked about a very similar prediction, so if you will, and absolutely just loving the fact that it's like the prediction has come true, but also feeling bittersweet because it's not exactly the kind of outcome one would hope for when one is talking about female labor force participation in India and in the context of the maternity leave policy. So I think today I just want to talk about 2 or 3 things, which is, of course, understand the key takeaways of the paper and discuss those in greater depth, but also supplement the inferences with some of our research that we've been doing at Nikore Associates, particularly talking to a lot of corporates and women and their reactions to this policy. How have they been in the last 3 or 4 years? And, also discuss some best practices of parental leave policies. Notice how I'm, changing the wording already from maternity to parental leave, and what implications this could have for policy design in India. So we'll start off, of course, with, what we always start off with, the decline in female labor force participation. So here I've used data from the NSSO to sort of chart out a long-term time series of labor force participation for the working age group. And we can see that, year 2011 and then 2017, but also, between 2004 to 2009 are 2 or 3 inflection points. We can clearly see a big drop in the female labor force participation, first in 2004 to 2009, and then hitting the nadir in 2017. And it's been a little bit of a rise in the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, I also wrote a piece on, I have a paper on this, but also wrote a piece on how this increase that we're seeing in 2020, 2021 is actually symptomatic of a poor quality of employment in the last 1 year because of the pandemic. But I think if we just break this down a little bit further, we can see that, the decline in female labor force participation in the last 1 or 2 decades, which is the most pronounced, has actually happened much more in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. And I think that links very interestingly with our paper, because our paper really talks about the maternity shock and then, of course, the impact of this amendment, which, of course, would be felt much more by workers in the organized sector in urban areas. And we can already see that, it's actually, when we look at this conundrum of labor force participation, it always is puzzling. There are 4 or 5 factors like occupational segregation, the increasing mechanization of agriculture, of course, unpaid work and care responsibilities, mobility restrictions, social norms around what kind of job you can do or cannot do if you're a woman. So a lot of these factors, and of course, gender gaps in education and skill training, particularly where, acting as a deterrent to women's entry into manufacturing sector. So a lot of these factors exist. So I think it's interesting that we're zooming in on the Maternity Act and the amendment. Now, sorry. Yeah. So now in terms of the paper, just coming back to the paper, as I said, it's a phenomenal paper to read because a lot of the predictions that people, commentators like myself, were making on the policy advocacy side, this paper really gives us the academic proof, if you will, to say that, this is actually happening. We must look at the data, and the data is actually bearing a lot of these issues out around the motherhood penalty, around maternity shocks. And this is, in fact, a very interesting analysis, because the paper very effectively uses the Indian policy as almost like a natural experiment to say that, this is the one country amongst many countries which has this policy, it's introduced this policy. So is it actually impacting those who are in the high fertility age group? And of course, the paper spotlights the demand side constraints, which again is very innovative and different compared to most of the narratives around maternity leaves and around labor market barriers, which really focus much more on the supply side, especially in terms of the fact that the time use data has just come out. We, in 2019, so we are all still, I'm writing a paper right now which is just looking at the different meaning and different cuts of the time use data, looking at different state level narratives coming out from the time use data. And it's very interesting that at this time we look at the demand side constraints, because the time use data really gives us much more of a supply side narrative as well, which is coming out from NSO. And I think it's the first time that this paper really makes it okay to say that maternity leaves, while important, are not effective by themselves, as the sole policy instrument for retention of women in the workforce. I'm not even saying that this is an instrument for, encouraging entry into the workforce, but most importantly, retention, because it is well known that it's the first, or the second significant milestone in a woman's personal life, and has also been documented to have a cliff effect. When we look at the literature coming out from McKinsey or, research coming out from a lot of companies like PwC, they are all talking about the fact that marriage is the first cliff effect, but the first child actually brings out, a much sharper fall in their employees. And so this is just something that I also wanted to highlight. Of course, we've talked about the amendment, but the implications of the amendment and what are the impacts of the amendment really, because we've increased the entitlement from 12 to 26 weeks, which is effectively 6 months. And the entire cost of these facilities is to be borne by the employer, making India one of the only countries in the world with such a long maternity leave, no parental leave per se, and then the entire cost being borne by employers. So the incentives, as we know and we've seen from this paper, get thoroughly misaligned. And even after these 26 weeks, and this is something which is there in the policy, but we're seeing it now. We're doing actually a study with Zoom and Gates Foundation on the impact of working from home on female labor force participation. And even there, we're realizing that a lot of women are continuing to, work from home even after rejoining work, and that itself has an impact on their promotions, on their retention, on their interest in staying back versus dropping out of the workforce. So there's a number of complex factors which are there in this decision. But the issue is that only women who are allowed to work from home after their maternity experience, but there is absolutely no discussion of men working from home to take care of the child at any point in this entire policy. So I think the negative impacts really, in my view at least, outweigh the positives, which is what I pointed out even when I wrote my opinion piece, which is that it reinforces these gender stereotypes that childcare is solely a woman's responsibility. And of course, there's an imbalance in terms of the cost of hiring both men and women. And I think that is something where, really the implications of the amendment and this cost differential, the kind of evidence that we're getting from the paper is very convincing and very much in line with the expectations from commentators like myself and also from industry. So, just to reiterate some of these findings, that women in the high fertility group, however we may define that fertility group, being less likely to be employed, average wages being lower in the post-reform period is almost incontrovertible evidence that, there is a disincentive towards hiring younger and younger women. And what this also kind of implies for the future is that if you don't create women in this 18 to 28 age group at the entry level, then how are you going to create more and more women in the senior management or the leadership levels? And then, of course, the higher cost of hiring a woman in the high fertility group is the main deterrent. So what is the implication of this for future gender wage gaps? If I look at the data today from PLFS, the gender wage gaps are somewhere between 63%, 64% for casual categories and, going down to 80%. So a woman's wage being 80% of a male wage for the regular categories. So, but if this higher cost continues to exist, then what does this really mean in the future for women's take-home salary wages? As we can see from these blocks, will the salary block for females have to fall down for these two levels of benefits to equalize at some point in the long run is something that, we need to think about as we research this topic further. And of course, the negative effects being more pronounced for those in high-skilled occupations or with higher education, it's a very logical result, because when we look at the actual implementation of this policy, it only covers 10% of the workforce, which is in the organized sector. Those who are working without contracts, those who are working in the unorganized spaces in primarily rural areas may not be covered by this benefit. In fact, the one benefit that they are getting is probably the cash transfer from the Matri, Vandana Yojana. So I think we really have to think about this dual structure that started to emerge, where organized sector, maternity benefits are much, much higher than what an unorganized person is getting. And also that they are actually being delivered, unlike, in the unorganized space, even though the law is technically for everybody. There's also an interesting survey that I wanted to bring out in front of everyone today, which was done by TeamLease in 2018-19 with about, 255 enterprises. And they actually estimated that because of this amendment, there would be a net job loss of between 1.1 to 1.8 million in the year 2018-19. Of course, it remains to be seen whether that actually happened, and we will have to study both the CMI and PLFS data to really know whether this bore true, but at least that was the prediction at that point. So it would be interesting to study that. Another important study I wanted to talk about was done by the IFC, which talks about the creches provision. So I think today in the paper, we didn't discuss so much about creches, but actually the amendment requires that, employers should set up creches. And of course, the cost of this is also to be borne by the employers. And the interesting thing is that the law only requires women to have the right to visit their children in the creche 4 times a day. But if men use the creche, then legally they are not entitled to visit the creche. And I don't even know if, again, we need to have more research on this to see how many men are actually availing of creche facilities in their organizations. But when a survey was done by the IFC in 2018 of, again, over 250 enterprises, even though nearly 80% of employers agree that, yes, this is a great step for gender equality in the workforce, on principle, I'm sure everyone agrees. But when it came to the implementation, almost 46% said that it was either moderately or very challenging to comply with this creche provision. They wanted some guidelines to actually set up the creches and what this would mean for their organization and how that creche facility was supposed to set up. And in fact, almost a fifth of the companies were even yet to consider setting up these creche facilities. And in fact, Shreya Raman from the India Spend team recently tried to update this survey, and she found that the results were quite similar even to 2018. So in the last 4-5 years, we actually haven't seen much of a movement towards setting up these creches and actually implementing many of the provisions that are enshrined in the Act. Now, other implications of this amendment, which can, of course, be future areas for study, points that I actually did point out in my op-ed piece even at that time. Of course, the fall in demand we are already starting to see in this research, and the reduction in upfront salary also, we are starting to see it in this paper. But I think the interesting thing would be to study increase in contractual employment, even for men maybe. It's an excuse in a sense that even those organizations which are operating in the formal sector, do they start offering more and more contract-based work and gig type work for skilled persons as well, just to avoid these statutory obligations. And when it comes to consultations done by Nikore Associates, we are definitely finding this to be the case. With the companies and women that we've been talking to over the last 3 years. And then in terms of the increase in informal employment, that is also a potential fallout, especially in the construction, agriculture, labor sector. Instead of moving towards a formalization of employment, we see that, will we see an increase in informal employment just owing to this amendment? I think these are two important questions for us to think about and consider as we move forward. Of course, the paper also makes important contributions towards the policy prescription for the design that, parental leave policies, of course, should be more equitable. And this is exactly what a lot of commentators are also saying. And appropriate compensation should be provided to the firms because otherwise there is that disincentive which continues. And if we just compare the Indian, sort of quantum of maternity leave with some of the most advanced countries on this, we can see that India is actually much higher, almost comparable to Finland when it comes to number of days of maternity leave, but then, shared and parental leave is absent in the Indian case. And this is even the case when we compare it with many of the BRICS countries, in fact, Russia being one of the leaders in the BRICS economies where it's offering a high portion of shared parental leave. But basically, if we look at a potential, configuration, Finland provides an interesting, example where they recently actually brought in their reforms. So that's why I'm highlighting Finland, which is that earlier they used to have a very flexible policy where, maternity leave was around 105 work days, paternity was 54, and then they had the flexible shared leave of 158 work days. But this kind of led to a lot of fathers not using the shared parental leave, and that would just be opted for by the women. In fact, 90% of all parental leave days were going to women. And this actually resulted in a fall in the fertility rate from 1.87 to 1.35 over the last decade. And, it was felt that there is a need for reforms. Also, the number of mothers with small children was growing in the ranks of those that are employed. So now the new policy has come in Finland where the maternity leave and paternity leave has been made equal at 160 days, and this is mandatory. And on top of that, the pregnant parent is entitled to 40 additional days of pregnancy allowance. Parents can shift around a maximum of 63 days between themselves. So there's still some, flexibility in the policy, but I think the basic change is the increase in the compulsory paternity leave. that's been brought in Finland, which is a very interesting example. May not necessarily work in India at this point in history where we stand today, given the social norms, but interesting example for us to learn from. So just a few policy prescriptions, from me towards the end. I think the basic principle that I'd like to emphasize is that the law needs to lead society in recognizing that childcare is not the mother's responsibility alone. I think there is a huge mindset when we listen to policymakers and when we have these discussions with policymakers that, oh, if you introduce a paternity leave, the man will take the paternity leave and the woman will still be doing all of the work at home. And I mean, fair enough, because if we look at the time use survey data, we know that women are doing 10 times the amount of work, unpaid work in a day as compared to men. And 44% of unpaid work actually goes into childcare. So it's a single largest, chunk of activities under unpaid care work. So it's not unfounded, based on what people are seeing around them. But at the same time, we need to say that the legalese needs to lead, the social norm will follow. Then in terms of what we can propound and advocate for, of course, the first one is around shared parental leave, move away from this concept of just maternity leave and shared parental leave, which can be shared flexibly. Because at this point, if we mandate paternity leave, it may not be opted for, or there may be resistance, at least from the policymaker side. So at least having shared parental leave, which can be determined, the proportion can be determined by the couple. So as a first step. Then, of course, the second one is really around the cost sharing. And I think, that's where a lot of people become a little bit unsure of, who's going to bell the cat and who's really going to bear the cost. So my, advocacy on this point and the point I've always talked about for the last 5 years is that there are two people, at least in a heterogeneous couple. I'm not saying that this would apply in the case of a single mom or a single dad or, a single person of other gender who wants to be a parent, in which case we can have separate set of rules. But given the current, nature of what is a representative family in the Indian context, there are two parents involved, there are two families involved, and the employers of the couple should share the total cost of the parental leave. And it should not be that the employer of the woman, in this case, I'm just saying woman because that's a typically representative scenario, should not be the one bearing the maternity leave cost or the parental leave cost entirely just because the employer happened to hire a woman. That's just discriminatory and is creating disincentives, as we can see. So if this cost of the parental leave can be shared equitably between the employers of the couple, that could be one solution. Of course, a proportionate pay system can also be devised. More, intricate rules can be devised, but this is definitely one option that's there on the table in terms of having a shared cost of the parental leave, so that the disincentive is removed because the man will be the father as well. So then you're just doing away with the gender difference that tilts the scale, in favor of the men when it comes to cost of hiring. And then in terms of government support, I think the government is already conceptualizing the establishment of a maternity benefits fund under the new labor codes. This could be, of course, conceptualized as a parental leave benefits fund and used to compensate at least MSMEs. I'm not saying that, government funding should go towards large corporates who can probably afford it, but at least for MSME sector, which is a big area of, which is a big miss when it comes to, full maternity leave benefits, and for whom it is a huge, drain at this point. Very honestly, when it comes to our consultations, a lot of MSMEs, which are even run by women, have said that, it's a big drain on resources. So for at least for them, the government support can be given. For startups, this government support can be given from the parental leave benefits fund. And they can cover in either the partial duration with the government support, or cover the entire duration at less than full pay. That can be a way of doing it. A lot of countries are doing it like that. And then at the end of the day, I mean, of course, there's gender neutrality in creche facilities. We don't talk about it enough, but we really should. So that, it's a small amendment. It's actually not even got a cost implication. But allowing parents access to creche facilities, in a legal way. If you have a law to allow women to access creche facilities, then that law should equally allow men to access creche facilities in the vicinity of the workplace. So with that, I will, conclude the presentation, but I think open to questions and, reactions from everyone. And a big congratulations to, Purna, Shreya and Debojyoti on this brilliant paper. It's really helped policy advocates to quantify the issues that we've been, predicting.
Thank you very much, Mitali, for a very nice presentation. You not only commented on the presentation by Purna, but also brought in new dimensions into the discussion regarding maternity leave and its impact on labor market outcomes, and also ended with some prescriptions on what you think can be done to repair the possible damage that these policies have made, apparently. So that's very good. I don't see any questions from the audiences at this point in time. Purna, would you like to come in at this point to respond to what Mitali has said? You're on mute.
I just want to thank you for taking time out and reading our work. And a lot of it is, of course, very useful for us. Particularly in terms of motivation, I think we can use a lot of it for rewriting. And thank you for your policy suggestions as well. I think we can have that discussion. If you have, I don't think you have any specific questions. So with regard to the work, so there were some questions in the Q&A, but we've already answered them. We had a few suggestions as well. So
yes, Purna, you have already answered those questions. So you have satisfied the audiences on their questions.
But happy to take any further questions if somebody wants to.
Well, if there are any questions that come to us even after this presentation, we'll be happy to connect them with you and with you as well, Mitali, if they come to your presentation as well. So thank you, everyone, for attending this 22nd webinar. And I will end this show for now over here and hope to see you again on other events by us. Like Preetha has put up, there's one coming up on October 27th and yet another one on November 3rd. And as you can see that we have a lot of presentations around women's employment. So Purna, the work that you have done, we will keep on working more and more on that. So if you write any more papers, please do send them to us. If you update your current paper, please send them to us. We'll put them up on the website and would be very happy to popularize your work. Spread it as far as possible. That's our objective. That's the reason why we hold these webinars, is to spread your work and to bring it under critical scrutiny to help you hone it further. So happy to engage further with all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And all of you in India, have a good evening.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.